Good afternoon. Before we begin, may I ask you to switch off your mobile phones and to stand up for the academic procession. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Professor Smail. Welcome to Atrium B, this beautiful location here in the heart of the University of Antwerp, in this recently renovated campus, and in the heart of our wonderful city as well, of course. Welcome to the conferral of one of the honorary degrees for 20 and 23. My name is Anke. I'll be your hostess this afternoon, and it's an incredible pleasure to be surrounded by so much knowledge, by intelligence, talent, and hard work. So let's make it a warm and interesting afternoon. Honorary Dr. Daniel Lord Smail will shortly be teaching a masterclass titled The Imagined Space of the Late Medieval Urban Household. During the masterclass, you can ask questions using the chat function on the YouTube channel. This is, of course, for the people who are following this ceremony online. And after the masterclass, there will be time for a Q&A session in which Professor Smail will answer the questions you submitted. Of course, the people here in this room can also participate in this Q&A session by using the very medieval technique of raising your hand. After the masterclass, we will proceed to the conferral of the honorary degree. But first, give the floor to Professor Luc Herman, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, who will offer you all even a warmer welcome.
Honorable Rector van Voeten, dear nominator, Professor Puttevels, dear colleagues and students, dear participants in all your titles and official capacities, dear Professor Daniel Lord Smail of Harvard University, nominee of the honorary degree in the arts, dear Mrs. Smail. On behalf of the academic community of the University of Antwerp and of the Faculty of Arts, I welcome all of you to this masterclass and award ceremony. Professor Smail will receive the honorary degree in the arts in recognition of his expertise in the field of medieval urban history, a field that is of special importance to our own history department. Today in Flanders, the region's history is more contested than ever, which means being an academic historian around here has become a challenging and sometimes even hazardous occupation. Part of the challenge consists of explaining and repeating to the hard of hearing that the past is continuously rewritten, and that even from a more or less shared present, different versions of the past will need to coexist. Professor Smail does not shy away from this persistent challenge. In his 2017 essay, Pattern in History, he takes a step back from his own work as a historian of later medieval Mediterranean Europe in order to consider what he feels he knows and what he doesn't know. His reckoning is clear. Quote, "It turns out that everything that could have been seen, felt, or heard, everything that could have been attested in the written document is subject to doubt." End of quote. Here is perhaps the real challenge for an academic historian. Facts such as institutions, processes, networks, systems, customs, norms, social facts, and even probabilities, all of which Professor Smail combines in his essay under the label patterns, must be teased out. Or, as the essay has it, to look for pattern in history is to bring the hidden into the open. Professor Smail is a master at doing exactly that. And it is therefore especially gratifying to see that he reserves an important place in the description of his research procedures for the so-called wild hunch, as described by Gregory Bateson, a creative and often counterintuitive move that is perhaps the best recommendation we can offer to those here in Flanders who would like nothing better than that the region's history be written in stone. So again, welcome to you all, and now it is my pleasure to give the floor to the nominator of the honorary degree in the arts, Professor Jeroen Puttevels, whose own work makes him particularly well placed to describe and honor the achievements of Professor Smail. Jeroen.
Honorable Rector van Goethem, dear Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Luc Herman, dear colleagues and students, dear Professor Daniel Lord Smail. What do self-medicating mice on cocaine, violence, containers, confiscation of one's possessions, and changes in one's sense of place have in common? No, I am not talking about Antwerp's war on drugs. All of these topics are part of Professor Daniel Lord Smail's academic oeuvre. Professor Smail is, to say the least, a very peculiar historian. He is a medieval historian working on late medieval Marseille and Lucca. One could call him an archive rat, for he is clearly fascinated by the documentary evidence of the age. Telling tales taken from the archives is his favorite way of painting a bigger picture, whether that be the medieval justice system or medieval men and women's attitudes towards their belongings. However, his thirst for history is not quenched by what he can find in medieval Mediterranean archives. He argues that historians should not start their investigations of the past when humans started to produce written sources. We need to go deeper into the human past, since there is no prehistory of humans, only history, the true longue durée, one might say. To that end, historians need to let go of their fetish of written sources and embrace true interdisciplinarity. This deep history led Professor Smail to consider the relations between cultural structures, the brain and the body, and the things that surround people. It triggered him to develop new concepts in neurohistory. One does not often read about endocrinal regulations and mice on cocaine in historical research. But this happens refreshingly in Professor Smail's work. In his book, Legal Plunder, he writes at the end of the introduction, lying behind this study is a desire to better understand every twist and turn in the long and complex historical entanglement of persons and things, to describe the patterns and irregularities that crop up again and again in human societies, and to understand the relations of power that undergird those regularities. The ambition is to write a history that seeks to explain humanity, not modernity, end quote. Here, Professor Smail shows his firm commitment to history on its own terms. Through his research questions and analysis, Professor Smail always succeeds in breathing a flair of inventiveness into, with all due respect, rather traditional topics in history, using sources which have been used by historians before him. Medieval violence is a topic on which generations of historians have been racking their brains. Notarial deeds have been turned inside out. However, Professor Smail has the gift to add a twist to a story that we think we already know. He has used notarial deeds to reconstruct the mental maps of different groups of inhabitants of 14th century Marseille, as he did in imaginary cartographies. Or think of the way the perspective of humiliation greatly enriches his analysis of inventories, a source that is often used by researchers in our history department. Through inventories and accounts, Professor Smail reconstructs the relationships between creditors and debtors and their things, the goods they own. When debtors in late medieval Lucca or Marseille could no longer pay, their goods were seized. This is when the late medieval repo men, officials who had the authority to confiscate goods, stepped in, which led to all kinds of humiliation experienced by the debtor and imposed by the perhaps even vengeful creditor, much like we saw happening in the financial crisis of 2008. While the banks were bailed out by the government, the same banks saw no problem in evicting families out of their homes. Debt forgiveness is socially selective, as we have seen with the bank bailouts, and the power still is in the hands of the creditors. But, as archival evidence shows, the debtors are not without power. For example, Niccolò del Tepa, whose house had been subjected to seizure by a surgeon named Jacopo Cellini, went to Jacopo's house to insult his wife, Vanella, calling her, start quote, filthy whore, end quote, and crying out, "Go back to the brothel," along with other words that the notary primly described as being disgraceful and shameful to the said Jacopo. Niccolò later returned, accused Jacopo of being a traitor for having seized goods at night, and then seized a rock and beat him on the head and the face. Thus, debtors did not always undergo the law as meek sheep, and the weapons of the weak can hit hard. Professor Smail argues that debt collection might have been an even more important engine of pre-modern state formation than criminal justice, which is usually attributed this role by historians. By being seized, debtors' goods entered into the realm of the written record, in inventories and into accounts. The website Documentary Archaeology of Late Medieval Europe, of which Professor Smail is the founder, that website tries to connect written and other collections. Hence, Professor Smail's exquisitely creative history not only inspires many historians, it holds societal relevance for today. In a review of Steven Pinker's book on the decline of violence, Professor Smail concedes that, indeed, the Middle Ages were a period with extremely high homicide rates. But does this mean that we are now somehow better off today? Just like medieval people, many of us may not experience violent death, but African Americans, other minorities, and the poor still have to face routine injuries and the humiliation of structural violence. Taking the perspective of the victim would allow us to include the fact that, for example, many women experience forms of non-lethal violence in the workplace and elsewhere in the public sphere. Here, and in the instances I have already discussed, historical writing, à la Smail, becomes a powerful means of social critique. Daniel Lord Smail's original and refreshing scholarship is characterized by a breathtaking intellectual envergure, a commitment to history per se, and an eye for history's relevance today. With you, I eagerly look forward to the non-cocaine-induced cerebral stimulus that awaits us in Professor Smail's masterclass. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go first. And I'll make sure to get you some water.
Thank you so much, Jeroen. I have to say, being called a peculiar historian is one of the highlights of my career, because it perfectly summarizes the fact that I like to move through so many different topics and the things that I work on. It's just an incredible honor to be here. That goes without saying. There's so many people, old friends and new friends that I've met here. And just the brief engagement that I've had with colleagues at the university here has just been so intellectually stimulating. And I especially wanted to thank Jeroen for, because he mentioned he had to go and read all of my things for this, and I wouldn't inflict that on anyone normally, but thank you from my heart for that amazing introduction. Don't tell the colleagues at my alma mater that I'm going to take my cap off, because I've never given a talk with a cap before, and I think I'd be conscious constantly of what was going on up above. So apologies for the necessity to speak to you in English. When I was a child, I actually lived in the Netherlands for a total of a year, and I picked up some Dutch when I was there, but only faint ghosts of it now remain. It's been a joy to come back and hear the language again, because it brings back some of these of memories. So as Jeroen mentioned, I've been working for the last, well, really, we published this site about two years ago and a bit, but I've been working on it for about a decade. This collection of inventories of secular households from later medieval Europe. So these household inventories have featured really prominently in early modern scholarship for many decades, and they've been hugely important in the Low Countries for scholarship on consumption, on standards of living for a good long time. The scholarship here has been the leader, in fact, in the study of household inventories. They're much less common in the period that I work on, largely before 1500. But I'm happy to say I've given you some sense about how in medieval scholarship, how the attention to inventories has been growing over the years, really quite dramatically, as you can see here. So we first published our collection just over 2 years ago. As I said, there's about 500 records in it so far. Several hundred awaiting transcription. And in a lot of my work, including the 2006 book Legal Plunder that Jeroen mentioned, I used inventories to pursue research questions related to material culture and materiality. But I've also, for a long time, been interested in the immaterial dimensions of household inventories. Behind every object phrase that you read in one of these records lies an act of perception. Because, and almost everyone who has worked with inventories has experienced the disembodied sensation of getting into a record and seeing the world through the eyes of the person writing it. And that's because so many of these records are done by room, so you feel yourself moving through the space along with the author of the inventory. So typically, we read inventories in search of representations of material culture. But the last decade or so has seen a growing body of literature that reads inventories in search of these acts of perception. And this is what I take to be a phenomenological approach, where the priority is given to the appearance of what the person is seeing, rather than the object as part of a material world. And I should have mentioned that when I was an undergraduate, I was also a philosophy major. So I'm also coming back to my old interest here in philosophy. In taking this conceptual approach, I've been returning to these questions that I asked in my first book. So 3 decades ago, I embarked on my dissertation. I read about 6,600 notarial acts from the city of Marseille in the years around the Black Death. And I was doing a lot of social history. I was doing demographic history, economic trends. But I was especially fascinated by the mental representations of space that show up in various clauses that locate people and property in space. And my first book was about these, I'm going to call them these precognitive maps. So precognitive because people aren't really aware that they have a map in their head, but there is a sort of map that is shaping the way in which they're viewing the world. So that's what I was thinking I would do in this talk, is bring the same approach to thinking about household inventories and contributing to this growing body of literature on urban space. And this has been really inspired by this budding collaboration that I have with colleagues here at Antwerp. So Peter Stabel, Bruno Blondet, Julie de Groot, and others. It's been a real inspiration working with you on these new ideas. So what I'm doing here is very much a work in progress. I find it hard to reflect on places I've been. I always like to go to new places. So I hope it's okay if I put out some fairly untested ideas for you here. And what I'd like to do in this talk is begin with a brief introduction to inventories from the period that I work on, the household inventories of the late medieval Europe. And then I'm going to follow through just thinking out loud about some of these things that I am learning from here, from this work. So beginning in the 13th century, inventories of secular households survive in increasing numbers in European archives. Some of the increase is certainly due to the accidents of preservation and survival. There's no question about that. But it is very likely that more and more inventories were being produced. One of the explanations for this, I think there's probably many, but one of them is that the growing number of inventories is driven by the monetization of the European economy and the growing availability of consumer credit. And the reason I think this is the case is that as you see indebtedness developing as a phenomenon in the 13th century, you find situations where heirs of estates face the prospect of inheriting estates that are burdened by debts. And you can see this becoming a problem in the literature. So the Roman law of succession that operates in my world, the Mediterranean world, allowed the guardians of underaged heirs to assess the value of an estate before accepting it, in order to decide whether it was worth taking up the debts that would necessarily come along with it. So the 13th century marks the opening of the age of the secular household inventory. Between the 13th century and the mid to late 19th century, there's a lot of inventories, and they fade in importance beginning in the middle of the 19th century. And over the ensuing centuries, the reasons why you would want to compile inventories begin to multiply. So inheritance remains a very prominent factor, but legal procedures unrelated to inheritance begin to generate a copious number of inventories. So here's an example from Bologna in the 13th century. Some of the earliest inventories from Bologna were generated by the pursuit of estates that had gone bankrupt. And so in this particular example, this is from 1291, a woman was pursuing the bankrupt estate of her husband, who was a notary. So there's a whole body of records from Bologna that's emerging out of insolvency or bankruptcy. Confiscation inventories, as these are called, targeting insolvent estates from Renaissance Bruges, have figured prominently in the work of Julie de Groot and Ineke Baatsen, Isa Stotterwagen. And we find similar records earlier all throughout Southern Europe. So this type of confiscation inventory is a very typical kind. And there's a similar type of inventory that was generated by legal proceedings against the estates of political exiles. I've been particularly interested in another factor that's driving the rise of inventories, and that's the rise of the second-hand market in goods, in household goods, that we find, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries. So inventories accompanied immediately by records of auction are especially common in the archives of Valencia and Barcelona starting in the 14th century. So this particular example, which you've just edited and published, is unusual because it's actually an appraisal of goods. It's not clear whether they're going to be auctioned, but it's part of this general phenomenon. So the interesting thing here is that post-mortem inventories were not required in late medieval Europe, but if heirs and family members wanted to raise cash by selling surplus goods, they had to prepare an inventory first in order to decide what was eligible to be sold at auction. And because the second-hand market was so active, they had to generate inventories because they were immediately selling off their goods. So there are lots and lots of inventories from the Crown of Aragon. It's probably the area that has the single largest deposit of inventories from the early Middle Ages. Later in the 16th century, the needs of taxation are generating inventories, and I'm sure there's other ones. Anyway, there's a lot of forces that are driving this increase in inventory production. It is generating a lot of records. So for Mediterranean Europe in the 13th century, the surviving inventories may number in the hundreds or possibly the low thousands. I think we have no idea how many there are, but there's certainly, there's a significant number. So this is a speculative figure. It includes the dozens of known inventories from locales such as Genoa, Bologna, Marseille, and the uncounted numbers of inventories in cities such as Bologna's Memoriale. So over the next 2 centuries, the numbers increase by orders of magnitude all over Europe, from thousands in the 14th century to possibly tens of thousands in the 15th century. And it's in the 14th and 15th centuries that we begin to find inventories in growing numbers in the Low Countries as well as other all over Northern Europe, with the exception of England. England's very late. Late medieval inventories are few in number compared to the millions or tens of millions that survive from the early modern period. From the Ottoman Empire to Europe to the Americas, there's just an extraordinary volume of sources, far too much to study the great bane of the modern historian. Isn't that right? So the late medieval inventories that I work on are few in number, but even so, the quantity far outstrips our capacity to present and analyze them all. So what we're trying to do in this project that I've been mentioning, this documentary archaeology of late medieval Europe, is make a subset available, and especially in a form that's possible to be subject to quantitative and statistical analysis. That's sort of the direction that we're heading right now. The records generated during the first 2 centuries of the age of the inventory constituted a vast experiment in metaphysics. And since that's an unusual thing to say, let me try to explain. When you set about the task of compiling an inventory, you have to do something that you normally don't do. As phenomenologists began pointing out more than a century ago, Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, many others, there's never a waking moment when you are not perceiving and interacting with your life world. So the engagement with the life world is precognitive. And what I mean by that is that most of the time, you don't actually perceive that you are perceiving, because sensation is just flowing in. The space around you, moreover, doesn't consist of objects in isolation. What you perceive, this is a phenomenological argument, is the totality of the space that you're in, and is subconsciously affecting the way that you interact, the way that you hold yourself, the way that you speak, your sense of confidence. So to make an inventory, the reason it's a challenge is that you have to see individual objects and isolate them from their context. So to appreciate how difficult this is, let's enter a kitchen in Antwerp during the Golden Age. And this I've drawn from a brilliant study of the kitchen from colleagues around in the Low Countries. So a person's perception of the kitchen would have been precognitive, an amalgamation of all the things that just arrive via the senses. So obviously the sights and smells, the warmth of the fire, the sound of the voices, and so on. And we know from a good deal of work that in addition to the sensory input, there's a lot of layers of meaning in the arrangement of things here that speak to gender norms, that speak to right ordering, or proper arrangement, or piety, or the difference, you can see it quite obviously in the background, the difference between public spaces and private spaces. So there's a lot of these signals that are also operating in spaces like this. So to make an inventory, to return to the point I just made, you have to dissolve that cultural matrix and you have to turn things into objects or commodities. So what you see in an inventory is not the totality. What you see is a brass candlestick or an imported ceramic bowl, a roasting spit, some pewter plates, and a host of other inventories. You have to rip them out of context and put them down in a list form. You see each and every object only through two aspects of its being, namely the fact that it is owned and that it has value. And everything else gets boiled away. So that's a metaphysical challenge. And if you doubt me, go and do an inventory of your office or your room, and you'll see how difficult it is to see the individual objects and to decide what you write down. So the metaphysical challenges associated with preparing an inventory don't end there, because they extend to the problem of defining what an object is, what you actually write down in your record. So to give you an example of this, here you have a bed, a room. Every object phrase found in an inventory typically describes a thing, a count or a number, how many of the things are there, and then a set of attributes, which is optional. So looking at this scene, one person might see a single large thing on the left, namely a bed. But it's also possible to look at this image, imagine you're looking at a real space, and see 6 different things, namely a bed frame, a mattress, a bolster, a pillow, a coverlet, and a canopy. So is this one thing or is it 6 of them? So what exactly is a thing that's capable of being inventoried? So this is not an academic exercise. Here in this record from 1405, the bolster, which I've circled there, is not a thing in its own right. Instead, it's an attribute or an adjectival property of the bed. We know it's an attribute of the bed because it appears in Latin in the ablative, uno traversario. Here, in a record from exactly the same year, the bolster is a separate thing, and it's listed separately on its own line. So there's 2 different people have made different decisions about what a thing capable of being inventoried is. And that's what I'm describing as the metaphysical challenge associated with making inventories. So from time to time, you can see people wrestling with the metaphysical challenges associated with making inventories. And what's really crucial about this, I'm not going to get into this detail here, but the compilers of inventories, the authors, received little formal guidance in how to respond to this challenge. So as the historian of inventories, Giorgio Riello, has observed, the law required or allowed inventories to be made, but it did not tell people how to do them. It did not micromanage the details of how inventories were made. Over time, certain conventions arose to govern the process of compiling inventories. People become accustomed to a way of doing it. And in addition, by the 15th or 16th century, we find more and more experts becoming involved. So the sources from the early centuries of the age of inventories are interesting, at least to me, precisely because a full suite of conventions hadn't yet developed. A lot of the inventories, not all, but a lot of the inventories are compiled by members of families or executors who have, by definition, have very little experience with it. They might have done 1 or 2 in their lives, if at all. So the records they produce, a lot of the things that we've put in our collection, are delightfully idiosyncratic. There's a lot of variation. There's a lot of, you can see people struggling with these philosophical challenges. And it's these idiosyncrasies, I think, that reveal a great deal about the acts of perception that informed inventories. One of the most interesting aspects of inventories is found in the spatial matrix that informs so many of them. So I'm getting around to the point of the talk. All inventories are lists. And like every list, they record items in a sequence. So the sequence of any list can be totally random. My grocery list is often completely random. But the more formal the list is, the more likely it is that the sequence will be determined by some kind of ordering principle. So you can think of a dictionary or an encyclopedia or the flowchart of an organization. One of my favorite examples in airports, sometimes destinations are ordered alphabetically by destination, and sometimes it's the time of departure. So there's different ways of ordering lists. There's no native way to order a list. At the outset of the age of the inventory, what principle did people use to determine the order of items to be listed? So the answer, somewhat counterintuitively, is that they did not use space or spatial location. We have about 100 inventories from the 13th century in the collection, and in almost every case before 1295, the records lack room labels and they provide no clear indications of room boundaries. So you don't see the space that appears in these early inventories. And I just wanted to give you a sense of what they do look like. This is one of the very earliest inventories that we have. This one's from Genoa. And you can see how they sorted things into these broader categories. Here's one from my own city, the one I studied, Marseille, the earliest one from Marseille, 1258. What we have in this situation, in both these situations, is that the contents of these houses is being ordered typologically. So these larger typological categories have been created. Within the categories, the objects are pretty random, but there's no space. The spatial matrix has been completely dissolved, and you see this typological organization. So starting around 1300, something interesting began to happen, and that's rooms begin to appear in household inventories. The earliest reference that I have found show up in a set of confiscation inventories from the city of Aix-en-Provence in 1295. It's a situation where the Jews of Aix-en-Provence were accused of having refused to pay a tax that was levied on them. And agents of the Count were sent to inventory the assets of individual Jews to hold them accountable for the tax. So here we see a camera or a bedroom showing up. It's the first reference I've seen to a room in an inventory. So many of the Jews of Aix appeared to have lived in rented rooms. So actually very few other rooms make appearance. I think there's one cellar, but otherwise it's just camera or nothing at all. In the inventories extant from Marseille in the 1290s, it is clear that the compilers of the inventories were beginning to list things in situ, room by room. Although the nature of the organization is not clear yet, because they didn't use room labels. You get these simple paragraph format, and you have to guess where the room was located. So it's really clear that they've moved from room to room, noted things in order, but they haven't yet created the template on top of that. So the earliest complete room by room inventory with room labels that I have found so far dates to the year 1315, and it's from the city of Marseille. And I should say, there's no way that this is a complete and random sample. I'm sure we're going to find earlier ones. This just happens to be the earliest one that I know about. This one dates to 1315. It's the estate of a woman, Alaïs Gasque, and it's from the city of Marseille. So I'll zoom in here. You can see right at the top, very clear room labels, and I'll just give you transcriptions and translations of what she's saying here in Provençal. So a quarter of a century later, at the time of the Black Death, the custom of making inventories room by room had become increasingly common. So this particular inventory starts in the aula or the hall. By 1400 or so, again, this is just in our sample, the majority of the urban inventories in the Dalmy collection, the majority, not all, were organized room by room. And I have to say, the rural inventories are completely apart, so I'm not going to talk about them. This is just the urban inventories. And many of them include room labels. So here's an example from Florence in this two-column format, which is very typical of the Florentine inventory. Sometimes they use 3 columns. And they always put rooms at the top of the column and a little space following it. And room labels also appear in inventories from London and other locales that we see. In Valencia, Barcelona, and Montpellier, the use of room labels is a little sporadic, but even so, it's really clear reading the sequence of items that the inventory has been done on a room-by-room basis. So let's walk through the pages of a typical room-by-room inventory from around 1400. This one's from Marseille. This is the inventory of a woman named Dulcia de Monteolivo. She was a well-to-do woman from Marseille. She died around in 1409, and she came from one of the city's most distinguished families. So here you can see, I'm not sure why it's crossed out, but you can see where they started the inventory. Then they move into the kitchen, in the bedroom off the kitchen. It's very interesting to note how the spatial layout of the page with the header separated by spaces, it's almost as if you can see the ensuing list of things as constituting the space of what the room is. Here we're still in the bedroom. The lower bedroom, again, a lot of things in the lower bedroom. The dispensa or the comptoir, the storeroom, and then finally things that are not objects but real estate and rents. So we see these rooms clearly marked by room labels, and the layout on the page itself is done in a spatial way. So not all inventories are formatted as tables or columns. I would have said in my period it's about half and half. The other format, if it's not tabular, it's simple paragraph format, just running like this. And in this case, in Marseille, they will always put room labels right before they enter a room. So I've pulled out in the example here in aula, and you can see how little period-like marks are actually marking out the room label to make it clear where people have moved. So before turning to the next section, I'd like to draw your attention to one of the curious features of the 2 inventories we've looked at, which is typical of virtually all the inventories that don't involve debt from this period. And that's that in none of them do we find appraisals of value. This is true for the vast majority of inventories, as I said. We do find object prices in records of auction and in the confiscation inventories, but they're almost entirely absent in postmortem inventories and similar types like that. So this is a bit odd. Since the nominal function of a postmortem inventory was to determine the total value of the assets in an estate, it is really curious that most postmortem inventories do not include appraisals. So I just want you to bear this in mind. I'm going to come back to it at the end. So I've been laying out this fundamental spatial or room-by-room organization that was not always there. It comes into existence. So embedded in this spatial or room-by-room matrix is a principle of containment. Jeroen talked about my interest in containers, so here the containers are coming in. According to this principle, the compilers of inventories conceived of dwellings and workshops as being very large containers. Each dwelling, in turn, contains rooms. That's the room-by-room matrix. And the rooms contain objects. Some of these objects are themselves containers, as you see here. And I'll give you a translation of what is being said on this page here. So in this case, we have a coffer. It's a container for a series of other objects. House, room, container. What you have is this telescoping series of containers all nested inside one another. So walking through the inventory of Dolcia de Monte Olivo, we saw how compilers used room labels to mark the moment when they entered new rooms. They did something similar for containers. The most common device was to mark the boundary, the entry point into a container, by using the preposition infra. So you see this preposition infra scattered all over these documents. So another device, which was uncommon, but I've been interested in, I should mention that on our site, as you can see here, we thought it was very important to do facing page transcriptions to see the original. So you can see aspects of the original that are lost in an edition. And in this case, you can probably just make out the thin bracket that's running down the left side of this page here. And this is a bracket indicating the contents of the chest here. There's a particularly vivid example from Luca, the whole bracket running down the side of the page here. I hope you can make it out of the back there, is a bracket that's marking the contents of a strong box, a forsterium. Within a room or a container, objects were located by means of their position in relational space. And this point has been made often in the literature on inventories. So here, in this particular one, a sequence of objects that almost certainly resulted. The sequence has almost certainly resulted because the compiler was simply moving from one object to the next as he or she was moving around the room. And I've done a little visualization of what this might have looked like, coming in, seeing the two dining tables first, and then two empty jars, and moving from object to object to object as they move through the room. And again, this is one of the assumptions of a lot of scholarship on inventories, is that the objects are all defined relationally within the space of the room. On rare occasions, compilers used spatial prepositions to describe these spatial relationships. So here's one example where the word juxta gets used along with several other spatial prepositions: in front of, next to, inside. So on rare occasions, the compilers use spatial prepositions to describe these. These are fairly rare occasions. They're rarely used, though. I've had to search actually quite hard to find examples of them being used in this context. So the sense of relational space that we find in inventories mirrors the use of relational space in property records. And again, here's something I won't have time to get into, but scholars who have worked on property records from the Middle Ages know that the majority of them, I have by no means read the totality of them, but most often a property is located by means of its abutments, so it's located in relational space. So that conceptual attitude is clearly operating within the inventories as well, where the relations of the objects in rooms is part of how is defining the objects in space. So the principle of containment that I've been discussing here, coupled with the further provision provided by this relational space, produces a medieval version of a GPS coordinate system. It made it possible to locate everything in space by means of nested containers capable of telescoping down to a single point. And the precision of it can be quite remarkable in some cases. Here you can see 6 gold rings are located very precisely within a series of 5 containers starting at the level of the house. And I should say, typically, the more valuable the object, the greater the number of containers that is associated with it in its space. So the problem with using a spatial matrix as the principle for organizing the sequence of a list is that not everything that could be owned could be easily located in space. So in other words, as this world is shifting from a typological organization to a spatial organization, they occasionally encountered paradoxes or things that wouldn't fit. My colleague Laura Morreale found this example in a Florentine inventory. You can see an entry floating off here on the right because it described an enslaved woman, and they didn't know how to list a thing that was a person in space. So they literally leave it in its own unspace. So there's lots of other examples of objects like this that are not easily located in space, but in the interest of time, I'll just give you another example. When you find donkeys, mules, and horses, you often find them in stables. That's where they're located. But sheep and goats, Marseille is a great center for herding, especially of sheep and goats. And they don't live in houses, they don't live in urban space, but they can still be owned. And this creates a problem for the people who make inventories. So in this particular case, is an inventory of a goat herd. The person trying to compile this inventory in the middle of the Black Death didn't know where to put all the goats. So they were located in the kitchen. They just were tucked there right in line. So for the sake of the closing discussion, let us assume, which would be a charitable assumption, that the small sample of inventories I've had a chance to review is representative of general trends in Europe. If that's the case, then we can make this following suggestion, that starting in the 13th century, early 13th century, there were changes in the economic and legal world, encouraging ordinary people, non-expert people, to compile post-mortem inventories. And then the custom of making inventories soon spread to other legal contexts and generating more and more. In the early inventories, people almost invariably listed assets typologically. In this choice, they may have been influenced by the dominant mode of classification at the time, because for centuries, the church had kept inventories of ecclesiastical treasuries and other church property. This was the form of the inventory that persisted all throughout the early Middle Ages. And these inventories were usually organized typologically. I've given you the example of Amiens Cathedral from the middle of the 14th century, but this is true for the other ecclesiastical inventories that I've seen earlier. So in a sense, the typological organization was conceptually available very early on as the secular public began making inventories. And there's a possible that the notaries who had connections with the clerics were also subtly influencing. But gradually, the men and women responsible for compiling inventories began to shift to the room-by-room format, which is the most fascinating finding that emerged from the work I was putting into this paper. It was completely unexpected, by the way. I had no idea I would find this. And then by the late 13th century, inventories were often being compiled room by room, though not necessarily with room labels. And then in time, in the 14th century, room labels began to appear in some locales. So clearly, the ordinary people responsible for compiling inventories were drawn to the idea of locating objects in a spatial matrix. And among other things, it simply may have been less work. because you can list the things as you find them rather than to regroup them typologically. But I can't help feeling that the room-by-room format, because it records spatial relations between objects and containers and rooms, is doing something important for the people that are making it. It's preserving the kind of intimate knowledge that is lost when things are listed typologically. So I'm going to have to leave this to your imagination, but you can easily appreciate how objects that were found in the main bedroom have more meaning, significance, history, family associations than the ones that are found elsewhere. You might have seen 2 dining tables in the stable. They're clearly junk, just sitting there. They have no meaning. Whereas the dining table that's in the aula is the one that has meaning. So you preserve all that meaning when you preserve room-by-room format. And the inventory becomes a much, much richer device for communicating belonging, piety, right ordering, gender, all these things that I mentioned earlier. So on this theory, the spatial organization was a device that people unconsciously used to smuggle meaning back into a record-keeping format that was not otherwise well designed to preserve cultural or personal information. So when inventories are seen this way, that is, for the insights they provide into acts of perception, the explanation for the phenomenon appears in a different light. So as I mentioned earlier, inventories were nominally about value. That's supposedly what they were about. So what's astonishing for me as a medieval historian is that people were completely indifferent to the value of the things. What mattered to them were the things and the spatial relationships. And that's why this emerges in the 14th and 15th centuries as the mode of keeping an inventory. So it's as if the exercise of compiling an inventory had acquired a different function from the one anticipated by the Roman law, namely that of preserving a complex but temporary assemblage of things and their spatial interconnections, with a view to preserving that assemblage for posterity. It doesn't have permanence, but you take a snapshot of it, you remember a life, you remember the person associated with it. So in the case of postmortem inventories, and this would not be true for other ones, but in the case of postmortem inventories, perhaps this urge to record assemblages was part of the process of grieving for the dead or remembering a life that is over. So I would be honored to have your thoughts on these and all the other questions that I hope have been raised by these fascinating documents. And thank you again.
Okay, are there questions in the audience? There's always somebody who has to be the first. So.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for this wonderful talk. I have a question, though. Jeroen started with also your book, your previous books, and the one I admire most, I must admit, is Imaginary Cartography still. Now, the relationship between space and social practice is kind of very different in that book from what you do now. So in Imaginary Cartographies, it's the practice of writing, social practices of dealing with space that define or start to define urban space itself. So they create, they have agency for urban space. Now, the space in your inventories seem to be there and seem not to be influenced by the inventories or by the practices of registering all these objects. It's kind of a, as you in the end said, a kind of memory practice that is developing. It's not doing something with the space, or is it? You were not very clear about this.
No, it's not doing anything. And this is something I've actually, I spent some time thinking about, Peter, because one of the big differences, and obviously I'm not going to give a review of the book, but in the book I had laid out the idea that there was multiple mental maps that informed different population or interest groups in their imagination of space. And over time, there's a gradual homogenization. So to give you one example, there's a number of records that identify city blocks as the basic unit of mapping. And that is dominant in the 14th century and vanishes by the 15th or 16th century. What we're not seeing is multiple ways of seeing space homogenizing and become one, which is the aspect of the power, the notaries that I mentioned, described in this book. In this case, Peter, what's really interesting to me is I don't see any variation in the way people do room-by-room inventories. It's exactly the same everywhere. I'm flabbergasted by this. I actually don't understand it because it suggests that there's a very powerful vernacular thought pattern that makes the inventories from Florence nearly identical in the spatial layout to the ones in Marseille. So it's a puzzle. Can I leave it as a puzzle for now? As I said, this is a work in progress, but you put your finger on one of my great anxieties in this talk was the universality of the phenomenon, the fact that there seems to be a vernacular technique that's common across all of the European sites that I've looked at so far. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. Fascinating research. I was thinking, how can you take it one step further? And we just had also an interesting talk at our faculty on the benefits and the value of interdisciplinary research. And I was thinking, are you also considering to use your vast and very extensive knowledge on these inventories and to pull that, for instance, together with the knowledge of an archaeologist or an architect working on medieval houses, and then maybe also pooling that expertise with someone who can actually do like three-dimensional reconstructions, like what, for instance, they are doing at the UvA by Julian Noordegraaf at a virtual interior project, where they are using also the information of inventories to actually try to recreate these kind of 3D models of how, in this case, 17th century Dutch houses look like. So would that be possible using your knowledge here and to pool it with other expertise?
Yes, yes, and yes. Right now I've been collaborating with some dear colleagues in Italy at the University of Bergamo on many of these questions, and they have been particularly interested in the idea of doing 3D reconstructions. In particular, there's a 3D reconstruction of a castle where they have not only the archaeology of the castle, but they also have the inventory, and therefore they're able to use the inventory to fill the castle with its original contents. So we're a very low-budget operation right now, and that's because it's harder for us to get access to European funds for the kinds of research that we want to do, and the US is not that interested in reconstructing medieval European households. But so one of the things that we really love to do would be work in people in engineering to develop the possibility of taking every single inventory in our collection, pushing a button, which would generate then a 3D reconstruction using the contents and digital avatars that would approximate the content, such as a bed or a chest or whatever, in a space that would be archaeologically valid for the region. So you couldn't know a 5-bedroom house. We don't, for Marseille and actually a lot of places, the archaeology is not developed yet well enough to tell us about these floor plans. We have some of them. So the idea is that and we certainly can't do it at the level of these houses because the footprint's long gone. But the idea would be to take a representative, plausible one and arrange the objects. We've done a beta version of this using kind of off-the-shelf software. And I have to say, it was utterly fascinating for me to we used the goggles, to walk into the house and see all the objects that had been set up so we could move through the space. It completely changed my understanding of the inventory. So this is something we're definitely going. On other aspects of the project that don't involve space, there's a lot of tie-ins with archaeology. So we call it the documentary archaeology of late medieval Europe. And so one of the things that's particularly important for me in particular has been to look at the archaeological record and what survives in there and juxtapose it to the documentary record. And so there's been a lot of scholarship on this. One of the things that I found most fascinating when I did this, I was doing a little study of belts, and the belt fittings that you find in the Marseille archaeological record, almost all of them were made of copper alloy. When you look at the inventories, 3/4 of the belts that you find in the inventories are made with silver belt fittings. So the archaeological record is seriously wrong in representing people wearing belts with copper alloy fittings, because everyone is actually wearing silver. And it's clearly because the silver is being retrieved and recycled that we lose it. So there's places where the archaeology and the textual evidence come together, such as these AutoCAD designs, and there's places where they're pulling in different directions, and it's the harmonizing of the two that I find the most fascinating. But thank you.
Yes. What I missed in your explanation, but you know, I'm not in history, so maybe completely wrong, but it's the pragmatic approach, because if you have an itemized inventory, then it requires a priori knowledge of what the estate is. And if you have this spatial kind of organization that you showed, then in a way it's much more objective, it's much more complete, it's a guarantee for being possible to replicate it, somebody else can come and look at it. Can that also be a part of the origin of this move from the itemized to the spatially organized inventory?
Yeah, the one pragmatic element that I mentioned is that I think the room-by-room format is actually easier to do, because you simply list things in organization. So I definitely think that that's an aspect of what's going on. The thing that for me is the most important is the fact that from what I have seen, there is absolutely no formal guidance on the process. There's no formal guidance that says the typological principle or the room-by-room principle is preferred for X, Y, and Z reason. So this is why I think that we're dealing with something that I'm calling precognitive. In other words, because there aren't any rules, what we're seeing are reflections of how people are seeing space. So there's no question that the pragmatic element might be it. And you'll notice in my final discussion, I was kind of on the fence about whether it was just ease of organizing information or whether there was some sense that people were appreciating it, the room-by-room organization for its greater fidelity to the meaning of the objects themselves. I don't know if there's anything in there that's provable. This is one of these hunches that Jeroen mentioned that I'm interested in. I'm putting it out there to think with, yeah. Thank you.
Another finger in the audience there.
Hi.
It ties in with Peter's question and Ilya's question on space and interdisciplinarity. In geography at this moment, there is also a relational turn, which is actually critique on Cartesian methods. And what they claim is that the relational methods can capture place qualities better. So it's what you're saying, right? It's that it can value places more and can capture value that people give to places more. And I was wondering, historically, when you look at these inventories and when experts come in and start doing it more systematically, do you see also an evolution there? Do you see that valuation of objects disappears, or do you see some kind of evolution there?
This is a question I want to leave to the experts who actually work on the 16th century inventories. I was dying to get the answer to exactly that question. Namely, my supposition would be that there's a growing body of experts who are involved in preparing inventories. This is certainly true in the cases of inventories that are prepared for tax purposes. And you see that, as I understand, in the Low Countries, and you definitely see it in England. There's still a lot of family-run inventories that across this. What's interesting from what I understand it is that the ones done by the experts do not necessarily turn back to a typological organization. Is this right, Bruna? I'm looking at people who've worked on 16th century inventories. There's no correspondence there, which I find interesting. It would have worked better for my argument if they had shifted back to systematically to a typological argument, but as I understand it, they do not. So in my period, the reason I'm punting the question is that in my period, there's very little expertise involved in this. It's emerging in Florence. That's where there's one court of wards where it seems likely that there was one official who was sets of officials who were taking charge of it. And in the confiscation inventories that I looked at from Marseille and elsewhere, there's definitely a court that's doing it. There's the one big difference there, which is quite striking, is that they tend to, rather than list items individually, they tend to bundle them into groups of not necessarily related objects. You might have a pot, you might have a frying pan, and you might have several wooden spoons, all valued at 4 gros. That never happens in the post-mortem inventories. So the non-expert family members never bundle unlike objects together. So there's something happening in that official world, the expert world, that's causing this bundling of certain lines. I've done another paper on that. I haven't gotten far enough to publish it yet, but your question gets at the heart of something that I'm really interested in looking at. Thank you.
Yeah, a little bit building on the earlier questions. From my reading of 16th century inventories, a disproportionate number of them kicks off in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. Which wouldn't necessarily, and in most cases, isn't the first room the notary enters. So I was wondering whether and departing from the first room they start with, probably they would follow a kind of a geographical, logically structured order, but still I'm wondering whether this betrays something of the specific high symbolic place the kitchen holds in Northwestern Europe, and whether this is different in your inventories, and more generally speaking, whether the sequence, they will never start in the attic or in some other backward places, backstage places in the house, and whether something of the sequence can also be used to map, to draw the mental map and the hierarchical map of how they perceive their domesticity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, that there is some kind of hierarchical organization that determines which room goes first, because there are some inventories, so the ones I know best are from Marseille, and there's some that begin in the portico. Clearly you're entering the house, and they'll list a few things. The majority begin in the storeroom. But we're talking about, I'm going to guess here, maybe about 30% begin in the storeroom. And in a lot of the cases, that would be a cellar room or a side room, certainly not the main entrance. So they begin with the wine-making equipment, which I do not understand, because it doesn't have the significance that a kitchen has. Oh, okay. But I did notice in the literature that I was reading for this paper, the preponderance of starting in the kitchen in the Low Countries here, which I just found fascinating, because in Marseille, I haven't done these data yet, and that's because not all of them have the labels, and we still have to go back to the work of supplying labels where we think they exist. And that's going to be somewhat time-consuming. When we do that, I think it's going to show that there's, apart from the storeroom, which is more common, it could be the aula, it could be a bedroom, it could be a portico. Sometimes they start in the kitchen. It's really random, and I don't know what's going on there. But it's a really important question. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Dan. That was a real treat. I wanted to ask a question about. Essentially, what I find very frustrating about documentary archaeology is just it teases us with potential, but as you say, there is this metaphysical challenge, as we only have this small snapshot of the object. And what I really liked about your work and about today's paper is you give us a little bit of an insight into the kind of, you know, the lived experience of these objects, as it were. And I had two questions to see whether this could be teased out a little bit more in these sources, looking at first, the room dimension, the spatial dimension, and comparing this to the work by Shannon McSheffrey on her work on late medieval London. And there she really works on the area of the idea of privacy and public within the household, so that the more within the household you go, the more private the household gets, and also relating this to questions of gender.
Yeah.
And secondly, what I found really interesting is like you have the spatial dimension within the rooms and the organization within the rooms, but also the objects themselves are contained sometimes these more precious objects like valuable rings, etc. I noticed that was the example, are contained also within other objects. And that is something I also found in my own research, is when they're talking about a precious object, such as a marriage ring, they're often contained in things like purses or little boxes. And so if you could perhaps reflect a little bit more on teasing out those kind of potential kind of personal meanings of these objects.
Yeah, thank you. So I was thinking very much about McSheffrey and also Kit French as I was thinking. I very rapidly passed over the gender and the right ordering. I haven't worked on that specifically yet, mostly because we're still in collecting mode, and there's been a lot of work simply involved in making the material available. But it's exactly one of the directions that we were going on. On the containers, one of the things that I've been really interested in the literature I've been reading on the use of inventories in the Low Countries is this technique that developed for using room counts as a proxy for the status, the social status, or the wealth status of the household. Some of that methodological analysis I found really interesting and persuasive. There's other ways of getting at the status of a household, and one of them is at the presence of certain types of objects, like kitchens that have spits, because they cook whole chunks of meat. By definition, typically higher status than households that don't have them. And we've been wondering whether it'd be possible to come up with some kind of set of measures, not just room, but also the presence or absence of things like spits, which are these diagnostic tools to come up with status. But to go back to containers, one of the things that struck me about containers is status. I'm going to go out on a limb here because I don't have any data to back this up, but my intuitive impression, is that the longer the sequence of container spaces leading down to precious objects, when you find those nested sequence, you're almost invariably in a high status household. The lower status households don't have those sequences. They'll list chests, but they won't list their contents. So there's something about preserving these nested layers of containers that's part of the display or the recording of the status of the decedent, or the status of the household to which the decedent belonged, that I think is really important. So I hope that's a partial answer, but I'm looking at the clock here and wondering.
Yeah, because there's one question that came in online, and it comes from, I believe, one of your colleagues, Ivan Gaskell. And his question to you is, how does the definition of the spatial matrices you described so clearly relate to the contemporaneous definition of the spatial matrices of real property? So I think he wants to learn more about abutments, for example.
Well, thank you, Ivan. So if I can take that aspect of it, namely the abutment clauses, and I think, Ivan, probably this is not directly answering your question, but my feeling about the relational space that shows up in the household inventories is that it's being influenced by the relational space that you find in documents listing property with all the abutment clauses. So I guess the idea here is that there's a whole conceptual apparatus that develops in one domain of use, dealing with urban property, that becomes conceptually available as people are imagining household spaces, and that's what explains the partial similarity. It's not an exact similarity because you don't find the complete set of abutments in inventories. It's not like the property documents, which will list things going all the way around. Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna. I have to close the discussion, I'm afraid. Or maybe just one more. Just one more for fun, and then we do the ceremonial thing a little bit faster.
Yeah, probably delaying everyone. I wanted to quickly go back to the fact that you said there was no value in the inventories. So I wanted to ask you, is it because the value is implied by its space in the house, that people just knew, as you said, the table in the hall would be just big value and bigger value than the one in the kitchen? Or is it because they're not necessarily interested in the value until it's sold? So you would have, as you mentioned, the prices in the moment when all those things are sold on auctions.
Yeah, so that gets at a huge question, which I'd love to talk about for a long time. So I'll have to. I think the issue is that there's different kinds of value, and one of them is monetary value. But the fact that they don't use monetary value is not important to them. To me, is striking. It's one of those silences or absences that deserve our attention. So I think there's different kinds of value, such as the value, exactly as you said, namely the value that's associated with the spatial location, that the bed that's in this room has more personal value. It may well be more expensive, but it certainly has more personal value and meaning than the one that's in the stable or in the maid's room or something like that. So that's exactly why I think the spatial layout is preserving a different kind of value system. The other thing that I've spent more time on is the length of the descriptive phrases that are attached to objects. Because to some degree, the length of the descriptive phrase, you can get a garment that might have 4 different descriptive clauses, such as material, color, accoutrements, and wear. You can have a long, long clause following a listing of a garment. And typically, the length of the clause is correlated with the personal value of the garment. So a tunic is just a tunic, unless it's a tunic with a long, long phrase. So there's a type of value that's associated with the length of descriptive clauses. And in Legal Plunder, I started an analysis of that to try to come up with a methodology actually for measuring the length of descriptive phrases. And I've got some tables in there. But I'll just close with something that part of the reason I showed you that appraisal is because I'm really interested in records where you can see 2 different records recording the same objects. So the appraisal follows an inventory. It's the inventory of the entire estate, and the appraisal is a subset that was left after an auction. It was over 2 years later. So you can find objects here, and you can see how they're described here, which I don't get to see this often. And it's really interesting. Some of the descriptive phrases are stable and they're reused. Other ones change completely. So I have a feeling that the mood of the person compiling the inventory has an influence on the meaning of the objects that they're seeing. And so this is one of the things I really like to study. I'd like to find other examples where we have 2 sets of descriptive clauses and actually measure the difference in them to see the variance in these actual perceptions of objects. But thank you.
We have to leave.
Thank you so much, Professor Smail, for your inspiring masterclass. It's now time to confer the honorary degree on Professor. Let's do this very fast, like Professor Puttevils said. Yes, the honorary degree on Professor Daniel Lord Smail. Nominator Professor Jeroen Puttevels can come back on stage and will deliver the laudation before the official conferral. And afterwards, the honorary doctor gives his own word of thanks, of course.
Dear Professor Smail, dear Dan, your scholarship and commitment to history incites enthusiasm in your colleagues. This is very welcome at a time when in the US, in Little Flanders, Ukraine, and the rest of the globe, history is instrumentalized, in the case of Ukraine and Russia even weaponized, for the needs of identity politics. While such narratives claim to be after the truth, they serve today's political needs. These histories are selective and biased. They are not deep history, but superficial history. Yet these histories are seductive and engaging, and exactly because of that, it is our duty as historians to be the critical thorn in the side. We have to go on the proverbial crusade, medieval pun intended here, to uncover false claims on the past and to show how complex the past really is, maybe even to the extent that we have to confess that while we aim to reach ultimate truth about the past, we might never reach the end of that quest. Your research and publications offer a complete toolbox to draw from, whether that be a telling anecdote presented with psychological subtlety, the use of insights from anthropology, the expansion of history into deep history, an infusion of psychology or a little splash of the neurosciences, or just sound historical craftsmanship. Even if you deal with warmer and perhaps more pleasant places around the Mediterranean, your work has much to teach to urban historians in the Low Countries and beyond. A reviewer of Legal Plunder, whose name I shall not mention here, described your prose as, beginning of the quote, an attractive and entertaining read, but the writing sometimes strays into irrelevance with philosophical ruminations, end quote. Yet, these philosophical ruminations are, at least in my opinion and that of my colleagues, what gives your work on medieval history wider relevance. So please, ignore this reviewer and continue to ruminate and inspire us. 7 years ago, I was asked at the interview for the position that I currently hold at this venerable institution, who I would invite if I would be able to organize a big conference. Without hesitation, 7 years ago, I proposed Professor Daniel Lord Smail. Standing before you today, it is an even greater honor to be the nominator of the honorary degree for Daniel Lord Smail. Thus, for all the reasons, I request the rector to honor Professor Dr. Daniel Lord Smail with an honorary degree from the University of Antwerp.
Go left, yes.
Thank you. Oh, I will take my time. I have a lot of time. No, we are really honored. Thank you for accepting this degree. Dear attendees, on the recommendation of the Faculty of Arts and by decision of the Executive Board, the University of Antwerp confers upon Professor Daniel Lord Smail, Professor of History, Harvard University, the degree of Doctor Honoris Causa in Arts for his groundbreaking work on the history of the medieval city and its inhabitants, their experience of space and their emotional lives, for his continued and successful efforts to demonstrate the current relevance of medieval history and to correct false representations of the Middle Ages, and for his deep exploration of the relationship between humans and things. And hereby I confer you this degree with the beautiful medal. I will take care of, yes, your cone. And if you had already diplomas, one more, please. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations. It's fantastic.
It is. Look at the photograph.
We'll give a hand, shake hands.
Sorry? Yeah.
Shake hands. Okay, for a photograph. Yes. The photo shoot. Okay, so please, if you would like to say some words.
Well, I could say many, many words. Profound thanks for the honor you've all done me, and for the care and attention from Jeroen, from all my colleagues here. It's really humbling. What I will add to that, if I may take another moment, is I mentioned this story to colleagues when I was working on my dissertation. The two great poles of urban history, as we all know, are Northern Italy and the Low Countries. And I did a lot of work preparing for my exams and dissertation on the Low Countries. And then with simply because of life, it is what it is. I work in the Mediterranean. I had not had a chance, other than sporadically, to keep up with the literature. So having the chance to come here and be with you, I spent the last 2 months just re-immersing myself in the amazing scholarship that has been done on the Low Countries in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. And it's just been revelatory and life-changing to come back to this amazing scholarship, for which you here at the University of Antwerp are centrally important. So, thank you.
I would like to finish this afternoon by saying a few words of thanks myself. Thank you again very much to Professor Daniel Lord Smail for all the incredible work you are doing, for the extremely interesting masterclass, and of course for accepting our honorary degree. And next to every successful man is a strong woman. Or another man, but in this case, it's a woman. So many thanks to Miss Kathleen Mary Milkern-Smail, also for joining our ceremony this morning. And we have a small but delicious and typical Antwerp present for you. It's chocolate. It's chocolate. Thank you to Rector Herman van Goetem, to Dean Luc Herman, to nominator Jeroen Puttevils, and thank you to the Faculty of Arts, who is very deep in my heart. Of course, thank you to the University of Antwerp. Thank you for all joining us this afternoon. This was the University of Antwerp's final honorary degree for 20 and 23. So I hope to see you again in 20 and 24, and I wish you a very happy reception.